Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening for this webinar. My name is Martina Dorigo, and I'm a dairy scientist at AHDB. Tonight, we will be discussing how to get copper feeding levels right in dairy cows with Professor Liam Sinclair from Harper Adams University. Last Monday, we had a very interesting and successful webinar on copper feeding in heifers, and this week, Liam will focus on dairy cows, and in particular, dietary factors influencing copper availability, effect of diet composition and starch level on copper status, and assessment of cow's copper status with practical means to avoid over or underfeeding. The Copper Project is part of the wider research partnership between AHDB and the University of Nottingham. A little housekeeping before we start. The presentation will take around 40 minutes, with time for comments and questions at the end, and we will aim to finish up within an hour. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone wants to ask a question, please type it into the box on the right-hand side of your screens, as shown in this diagram. At the end of the presentation, Dr. James McCahern, also from Harper Adams University, will join Liam to address your questions. If for time reasons we can't answer them all, you will get a reply by email in the next days. Also, tonight's presentation will be recorded and will be available to watch back together with last Monday's presentation with James on the AHDB Dairy YouTube channel or via the follow-up email you will receive. If any of you are Dairy Pro registered, please put your name, date of birth, and farm name, including postcode, into the question box. Finally, we will endeavor to keep this webinar running as smooth as possible, but please bear with us if we encounter any technical difficulties. We will, of course, try to keep this to a minimum. Some information about this evening's presenter. Liam Sinclair undertook a degree in agriculture with animal science at Aberdeen University before moving to Nottingham University, where he completed a PhD on the interaction between dietary energy and protein supply on microbial protein synthesis in the rumen. He then moved to Harper Adams University as a lecturer, progressing to Professor of Animal Science in 2010. His research focuses on dairy cows and includes improving the health attributes of milk, increasing forage utilization, improving mineral nutrition, and reducing the environmental impact of dairy cows. Liam was awarded the Sir John Hammond Prize in 2011 for his applied research in ruminant nutrition and ability to transfer research findings to industry. In 2016, he was elected as the president of the British Society of Animal Science. For the Q&A part of the webinar, James McCahern will be joining us. James undertook a degree in agricultural technology at Queen's University Belfast. He then moved to Harper Adams University, where he completed his PhD on copper metabolism in dairy cattle under the supervision of Professor Liam Sinclair. He went on to join Harper Adams University as a lecturer in 2020, focusing on cattle production system and trace element supplementation. So, without further delay, Liam, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Martina. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, good evening, and welcome to this presentation on dietary copper feeding levels. This is a progression from James's presentation last week, where he was looking at the effects of overfeeding copper, particularly during the rearing period. And in this presentation, we're going to be focusing on how do we determine how much we need to feed and how we get feeding levels correct. We seem to have frozen. Okay, just as a very brief recap, copper is the most common trace element deficiency in ruminants. And it is involved with a wide range of functions within cattle and is a cofactor in over 300 different proteins and enzymes. And signs of deficiency include pigmentation. So this is the characteristic spectacles that you would see in cattle, and also changes in the coat color. That's to do with an enzyme, tyrosinase, that's a copper-dependent enzyme. But also aspects of reproduction and growth, which is what most dairy farmers would associate copper deficiency with. But copper is also involved in a variety of other functions, including immune, cardiac function, and changes in bones and joints. So the effects of copper deficiency have been well established for quite a number of years, but copper is also the most common mineral toxicity, with over 20 to 30 cases per annum being reported, which is really just the tip of the iceberg, because often there are many more cases than that, even within a herd, that there are issues and problems apart from the animals that have actually died due to toxicity. So if we focus on some of the underfeeding aspects of copper, so where we have a copper responsive disorder, then this is the sort of data that we'd associate with that. So here, this is a study that had 60 grazing dairy cows. They were either not supplemented with a bolus, or they received a combined mineral bolus, which contained copper, selenium, and cobalt. And there were high levels of molybdenum in the grass. And I'll come back to how molybdenum plays a function a little bit later. But this is what most people would associate with a copper responsive disorder, where given the bolus has reduced the cervices per conception and has reduced the calving interval. But there are some caveats within this. First of all, this is a combined bolus, so we don't know exactly whether this was just due to copper. And a lot of the literature often is combination products that have been fed, making it a little bit difficult to sometimes tease out whether it was an effect of copper. And it was dependent on this high level of molybdenum. But certainly there's a lot of evidence out there that if we have a underfeed copper, or a situation where copper is deficient, then we can have negative effects, particularly on fertility. But equally, as James pointed out last week, overfeeding copper can also have a negative effect. So one outcome is toxicity and death, which is quite clear. But also some of our recent work has demonstrated that feeding above the recommended level, and in James's study, he fed either the recommended level, and we'll discuss how we calculate that a little bit later, and then approximately twice that level from heifers from about 4 months of age into their first lactation. And what the higher level of copper did was to cause animals to come onto estrus earlier, which was quite good. But when they did come onto estrus, then their cervices per conception were increased, and the number of animals pregnant to first and second cervix were significantly decreased. And James also found that there was a lower milk yield post-calving, particularly in that early postpartum period, and other indicators of liver damage were present as well. So we have this difficulty with copper, that if we underfeed and don't feed sufficient, we can have negative consequences, but equally, if we overfeed, we can have negative consequences. So getting the feeding level right is particularly important. So how much are we feeding on UK dairy farms? Well, this was a survey that we did a few years ago, where we went on to 50 farms in central and northern England, and we sampled everything that the cows were consuming. So we sampled the total mixed ration or partial mixed ration. We also sampled concentrates being fed in the parlour, and then supplementary sources, whether they were free access minerals or blocks or whatever sources were available, including the water supply. Now, the recommended feeding rate is around about 11 to 13 milligrams per copper, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. But in our survey, we found that most farms were feeding considerably more than that. So this is our 50 farms along the axis here, and this is how much dietary copper they were feeding. So each farm here has got a different level, and I've just graded them here from left to right. And you can see that most farms are coming out in this kind of region here. So this blue line indicates how much they should be fed under most normal dietary conditions. The 20 is how much the UK feed industry has indicated is the maximum amount that should be fed, unless there are really quite severe reasons. You shouldn't be feeding above 20. And 34 is now how much the EU would state would be the legal maximum. At the time we did the survey, it was 40, but now it's been reduced down to 34. And in early lactation, 10 of our herds were feeding above the 34 milligrams, so that is an illegal amount, and 40 or 80% were feeding above the 20 milligrams, and all herds were feeding above requirements. So on average, they were receiving round about 28 milligrams per kilogram dry matter, compared with a requirement of 11 to 13. So that's about 2 to 2.5 times the amount. So where was this copper coming from? Well, copper was obviously included in the concentrates, but it was also added to the partial or total mixed rations. They often made up the largest proportion that was being consumed, but there were a variety of other sources as well. So this next figure just represents the total mineral source supply. So we had blocks here, some of which were fortified with trace minerals, including copper. Boluses were used on nearly 40% of farms. Some of these were used on heifers, but if those heifers were then calving into the herd, there would be a residual effect of those boluses. But some farms were using boluses in the cows as well. Others had free access minerals. Some were drenching, some were using injections, and some were using water. So there's a wide variety there, and the take-home message is that it's not where the source is coming from, it's the total amount that we need to be aware of. Because where there have been issues of breakdowns in terms of copper feeding and toxicity, often nobody knew how much was being fed, and that copper supply from a number of sources wasn't being taken into account. Okay, so we've established that underfeeding and overfeeding isn't particularly good, and we have established that most herds are overfeeding. So how do we calculate how much we should be feeding? Well, how much we should be feeding, and we can express that as milligrams per day or milligrams per kilogram dry matter, is quite a simple equation. It's how much the animal requires, and this could be a requirement for maintenance, could be a fetal requirement for milk production, divided by how much copper is being absorbed. And in dairy cow nutrition, it's not the tissue requirements that the problem is with, because we are pretty good at determining how much the animal actually needs. The issue often centers around how much is being absorbed. And that's what creates the confusion and the wide variation in terms of how much copper we need to feed. So again, I'll just go through how much we should be feeding. And under normal dietary conditions, that should be 11 to 13 milligrams. Under exceptional circumstances, we may want to be around about 20 or above. And the EU legal limit is 34 milligrams per kilogram dry matter for adult cattle, and it is half that level for calves. And the reason it's half that level for calves, we'll explain in a minute. So in terms of copper responsive disorders, and that's the phrase that is preferred to be used rather than copper deficiency. So often we would refer to it as a copper responsive disorder, can either be primary or secondary. And primary is where we have insufficient copper in the diet. But as we saw, most dairy farms are feeding more copper than what the animal actually requires. If we look at the range and copper content of feeds, we can see that there is quite a large range. Grass has between 7 to 11 when it's in its vegetative state. If it's very mature, then it can be lower at 3 to 8. Maize silage, as with most other minerals, copper tends to be low in maize, whereas some of our supplementary protein sources are higher. So soybean meal is at 17, there should be grams per kilogram dry matter, not milligrams per kilogram dry matter. And malt distillers' dark grains is considerably higher. So wherever we have a distillery byproduct in there, and something like spey syrup would be included as well, then it can be considerably higher than that. So wheat and barley is a little bit lower at round about 5. So in most situations, we don't have a primary deficiency. And as we saw, we're often overfeeding. So what is a secondary responsive disorder? Well, the amount of copper that's absorbed in adult ruminants is particularly low, at only 3 to 5%. But if we compare this with calves, then it can be up to 70%. So the major factor that's the difference between an adult ruminant and a calf is what's occurring within the rumen. And we know that certain other minerals have a large effect on how much copper is going to be absorbed. And the minerals that we know that have most effect include sulfur and molybdenum, and they've been most well characterized. But other minerals can also have an effect, including iron, zinc, and manganese. But most of the discussion will be around sulfur and molybdenum. So how does sulfur and molybdenum affect copper availability? Well, within the diet, we have got copper, molybdenum, and sulfur. So these may be from background levels in our forages or concentrates, such as soybean meal or rapeseed meal or wheat, or we may have supplementary sources in here of copper, but most of our molybdenum and sulfur will actually be due to the background levels from the other dietary ingredients. These go into the rumen, and within the rumen, the molybdenum and the sulfur bind together to form what's termed thiomolybdates. And these thiomolybdates bind with a high affinity with copper and effectively lock the copper up within the rumen. And this makes the copper unavailable when it gets to the small intestine, and the copper becomes excreted in the feces. So the copper is unavailable. Now, under certain circumstances, if there is insufficient copper within the diet, the thiomolybdates may be absorbed directly across into the bloodstream, and they may then interact with copper that's contained in enzymes within the blood. But the situations in which this occurs are much fewer than occurring within the rumen. And the exact situation where this is of commercial importance is difficult to predict. So I'm not really going to be focusing on that very much. I'm going to be focusing more on what's going on within the rumen, because it's of greater importance. So how does the copper, molybdenum, and sulfur interact? What effects do they have, and how can we quantify it? Well, there's a number of prediction equations that we can use to try and predict the effect of sulfur, molybdenum, and copper absorption. And in the next graph, I'm just trying to present that visually so you can see what the effects are. So here we've got dietary sulfur concentration in grams per kilogram dry matter. So this is here, most of our diets will be falling at around about 2 to 2.5 grams per kilogram dry matter. And this is our dietary copper requirements going up this axis here. So going from 0 up to 60. And this is if we had 1 milligram per kilogram dry matter of molybdenum in the diet. And in our survey that I presented of copper, we also measured molybdenum, and the average molybdenum level in the 50 farms was round about 1.2, 1.3. So not too different from this one level overall within the diet. And we can see that as we increase dietary sulfur levels, then the amount of copper that is required also increases because of this interaction between molybdenum and sulfur within the rumen. If our diet has got 2 milligrams per kilogram dry matter of molybdenum, then we require more at all levels of dietary sulfur. And that effect becomes more pronounced if we have 5, and even higher if we have 10. From our survey that we did on the 50 farms, the highest that we found was 5.5. Most farms were coming out between 1 and 2. Just one farm was 5.5. So most farms are coming out round about that region. So if we look at typical dietary sulfur levels and typical dietary molybdenum levels, then we would be somewhere in this region. And that's where we get our dietary copper requirement coming out at round about 11 milligrams per kilogram dry matter. But you can see that it's not a fixed amount, and it can vary depending on our dietary levels of sulfur and molybdenum. So what factors can affect how much molybdenum we have and how much sulfur we have within the diet? So what management factors can affect those two? Well, one factor that we know that can affect particularly molybdenum is the soil pH. The amount of copper in ryegrass is reasonably constant with soil pH, but the amount of molybdenum increases. So as we increase the pH of the soil, then forage content of molybdenum can increase as a consequence. And we also know that compaction appears to increase molybdenum availability. which we think is to do with creating an anaerobic environment and making the molybdenum more available. But compaction also seems to have an effect. We also know that certain areas of the country have got high molybdenum concentrations. So somewhere like Somerset, for example, have got high levels because of their underlying geology. And we also know that, for example, second cut silage tends to be higher than first cut silage. And even within a farm, there can be variations from field to field and from silage cut to silage cut. And on average, molybdenum levels appear to be increasing. We're not quite sure why that should be the case, but if we go back 5 years, they were somewhere about 1.3, 1.4, and they're now slightly higher, somewhere around about 1.6, 1.7, and perhaps increasing a little bit in 2018. If we consider sulfur, then sulfur concentrations in grass have also been increasing slightly. Now, traditionally, sulfur was deposited on grassland from things such as coal-fired power stations. And back in the 1970s, acid rain was much more of an environmental concern than what it is now. But we now have a situation where we have very little energy being generated from coal-fired power stations. In fact, we have periods of time where no electricity is generated from coal-fired power stations. And those that do remain tend to have scrubbers fitted that reduce the amount of sulfur that's being emitted. So as a consequence, a lot of pasture can actually benefit from sulfur fertilizer. And in some instances, that can be up to 35%. So there can be financial benefits and yield benefits from having sulfur fertilizer application. And that may be resulting in this slight increase in sulfur concentrations in grass over time. It's not a reason not to supplement with sulfur containing fertilizer. If there's a benefit to your farm, then I would advise that you do. But a consequence might be a slight increase in sulfur concentrations. So how important are these apparent increases in molybdenum and sulfur? Well, this is going back to the previous graph that I had showing dietary sulfur and dietary copper requirements at different molybdenum levels, coming out round about 11. And if we put in these two values for forages, this isn't for the diet as a whole, remember, it will be affected by other dietary components. But if we look at the forages, then that's coming out slightly higher, perhaps around about 13. So that's why we say somewhere around about 11 to 13 milligrams per kilogram dry matter would be the animal's requirements under most dietary situations. But the biggest piece of advice is that you don't just rely on average values and that you analyze particularly the forages to determine what the situation is on your particular farm. So if you have got very high levels of sulfur or molybdenum, you want to know that. Hello, James.
You're right there, Liam. Oh, sorry, go.
We seem to have lost the presentation there. Hold on. Can you still see my screen?
I can see your screen, yep. Give me a shout if you want to run it from mine, but you seem to be back on, so you can carry on as you were. But if it happens again, just let me know.
I'm not quite sure what happened there. Okay, can we see that okay?
Yep, all fine.
Yeah,
as you were.
Apologies for that. I'm not quite sure what happened there. A little bug in the system. But this is a typical forage analysis here. They're not too expensive, 35 to 40 pounds, so comparable to what you would send a forage analysis away for its chemical composition. If you also send a sample away, you can get a mineral composition as well. And this is all the major minerals that we have here, so calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. So phosphorus is another very important area we have a project looking at with the HDB whole farm phosphorus balance. But we're going to be focusing on the ones relating to copper. So in this particular example, we can see in this grass sample, which was from a commercial farm, that they've got very high levels of sulfur. So here in this example, around about 3.9, so it is quite unusual in having a very high content. In contrast, the other two, molybdenum's coming out at round about 0.8, so it's a little bit below average, and copper is just below 10, so it's about average. So if we were just looking at this particular grass as being the sole forage, perhaps for replacement heifers, then we would calculate that this would require somewhere in the region of 17 milligrams of copper per kilogram dry matter. So an average is 11 to 13, but if your forage analysis tells you that you've got a particular problem, either in molybdenum or sulfur, then you may need to feed a different level. So if you go through those calculations, and this would be done on most rationing packages, you can also do it on a spreadsheet if you wanted to, if you haven't got access to a rationing package, but most rationing packages would allow you to do this relatively easily and quickly. But once you've done that, and if you now determine, well, that you are or have been overfeeding copper, one thing is to reduce levels, the second is to determine what the status is within the animal. So how do we know within your cows if cows are being over or under supplemented? Well, one way to do that is to look at blood copper levels. And generally the level you'd be looking at here is more than about 9 micromoles per litre. And blood copper is a useful way of determining if your animals are marginally or deficient in copper. So if you think that you have a copper responsive disorder and you're not feeding sufficient, then this would tell you that. But in most circumstances, and once you are feeding sufficient and then feeding more than sufficient, then those values don't change very much. We can also look at a number of blood enzymes, and there's a variety of enzymes. I said there's a lot of enzymes involved with copper metabolism. One is ceruloplasmin. That's how most of the copper is transported in the blood. It's also involved in iron metabolism. And this is another one here, got quite a long name, superoxide dismutase. That can also be used as an indicator, but generally they don't vary very much unless the animal is either marginally deficient or deficient. What is more important is to look at liver concentrations. And this can either be done by a biopsy, of which you'd need to take a vet in, or you could also do it on liver samples from cull cows. But you need to select your cull cows carefully and just make sure that they're not being disposed of for any reason that might also affect liver metabolism. And the general range that we'd be looking at, and I'm expressing it here in terms of milligrams per kilogram dry matter. Some people would express it as micromoles per kilogram dry matter, but it's effectively the same. And we'd be looking for a range of somewhere about 25. Anything below 25 would be termed deficient or marginally deficient, up to 510. And 510 is generally taken to be the level that we really don't want to be above. And in studies that have looked at cows going through slaughterhouses, then round about 40% of dairy cows going through slaughterhouses have been shown in other work to have liver copper concentrations that are above that upper limit of 510. In contrast, beef cows tend to be the opposite. Beef cows tend to be closer to this level. So around about over 50% of beef animals were deficient or had low copper levels. So it depends very much on your individual farm and system. This would be a healthy liver here if we were to take a sample. This is showing a liver here that's got very high levels of copper. This is actually a sheep liver, but nevertheless the characteristics would be the same. And if we continued feeding high levels of copper to these animals above that 510, then we run the risk of toxicity, which would be evidenced by sort of anemia and jaundice, blood in the urine as a consequence of what's called intravascular hemolysis, and the cows will be dull and lethargic. And within a very short period of time, within 24 to 48 hours, we could have an animal that was dead. So liver samples are the best way of doing that. But again, I go back to analysing the forages and other feeds first to tell you whether you think that you have a situation where you may be overfeeding copper. And also to emphasise that you should include copper supply from all mineral sources, not just what's in the TMR. If you've got free access minerals or you're giving other sources, you need to include those, and that one person knows what's going on. Because as I mentioned previously, where there have been breakdowns in terms of copper feeding and toxicity, often nobody knew how much was being fed. So why does liver content vary so much, and what things can affect that? Well, this goes back to James's study that we spoke about last week, and that's where we took a group of heifers from around about 4 months of age, and we took them through well into the first lactation, and we measured liver copper concentrations at 4 different times. We fed them 2 different levels of copper, the control, which was around about the animal's requirements, and high, which was round about 30 milligrams per kilogram dry matter, so about twice the level that the control were getting. So we started at 4 months of age, but the first liver biopsy sample wasn't taken until 7 months of age. And you can see 2 things here. First of all, you can see that the high animals had got greater concentrations of copper within the liver, but that both sets of animals were above this threshold level. So this is our threshold of about 510, and at 7 months of age, they were both above. And we feel that that is to do with the fact that when the animals are pre-ruminant and transitioning to being ruminants, they are absorbing more copper. And overfeeding copper at that time was resulting in very high levels of liver copper and also other indicators of copper damage. But as we continue to feed, both levels came down, so we're now within the safety zone here of between 25, which is down here, and 50. And they were both round about the same levels at 14 months, so just prior to insemination, and pre-calving. And we still have this difference between the 2. So there was a decline. So they're now within the safe zone, which was good. But then when we transferred the animals into the lactation diet, what we found was that liver copper concentrations shot back up again. Now, the important thing to bear in mind is that we didn't change the copper concentration in the diet, and the molybdenum and sulfur concentrations were also kept similar within the diet. So this large increase that we have here in both groups of animals wasn't to do with copper, sulfur, or molybdenum changing. It was to do with something else in the diet. Some reason why moving from a rearing diet to a lactation diet caused a large increase in deposition within the liver. And what the liver does is that if we are supply insufficient copper, then the liver will release that copper into the bloodstream. And if we supply more copper than what the animal requires, then it will deposit it within the liver. So this increase here is an indication that the animal is being oversupplied with copper or is absorbing more copper, despite the fact that the copper concentrations in the diet remain constant. And it wasn't due to, as I said, due to differences in sulfur and molybdenum. So what was happening? Well, we know that when we moved the heifers from the rearing diet onto lactation diet, that the diets changed to having a higher maize content, and that they also contained higher levels of concentrates, as you would expect in a lactation ration. So it raised the question, was it the change in forage over to maize silage that caused this effect? Or was it the higher feeding level of starchy concentrates that was having this large and dramatic effect in terms of copper status? So we did a study where we looked at the effect of feeding maize silage or grass silage on the copper status in dairy cows. And in this study, we used 56 cows and we fed them either a maize silage-based ration or a grass silage-based ration. And here we took them into our feeding system, or applied feeding unit at Harper Adams. And these blue bins here, we can put different feeds in, and only the cows that are allowed into those feed bins can get in, and it records their intake. So the big advantage of this is that everything else in the cow's environment is exactly the same. They're milked through the same parlour, they're lying in the same cubicles, it's the same herdsperson. The only difference is whether they had a grass silage or a maize silage-based ration, and whether we added extra sulfur and molybdenum. So in this study, we fed 19 milligrams of copper, which is above the animal's requirements, which we said were 11 to 13. And this was fed either with or without added sulfur and molybdenum. So this is something that we can do experimentally, not something you would do commercially on farm, but we added extra sulfur and extra molybdenum into the diets. And we did that because we wanted to have a situation where this 19 milligrams would be insufficient and the cows would be mobilizing copper from their liver. So if we focus on the maize-based rations to begin with and just look at some of the background performance indicators. So the intake was similar, whether we fed the maize silage or the maize silage with this added sulfur molybdenum. And this is added amounts. The total amounts in the diet were about 3.5–4 grams of sulfur and around about 8 milligrams of molybdenum. So quite high levels of molybdenum and sulfur in there in the supplemented ones. But we didn't find an effect on intake. We didn't find an effect in milk yield, and plasma copper concentrations weren't affected. When we looked at the grass silage-based rations, so fed the same amount of copper and the same added amount of sulfur molybdenum, then we found that when we added the sulfur molybdenum, that dry matter intake decreased by about 2 kilograms per day. Milk yield wasn't depressed very much, but body condition score was lower in the animals fed the additional antagonists. However, plasma copper concentrations remained constant. They didn't vary, but the cows did have higher cell counts. We're not sure whether that's to do with something to do with the sulfur molybdenum or due to the overall dietary stress of having a lower dry matter intake. So just to recap, we fed 19 milligrams of copper, high grass silage or maize silage, either without or with added sulfur molybdenum. So now we're going to look at what happened to the liver copper concentrations as an indicator of copper status. So rather than providing the absolute amounts, what I'm going to look at or present is the change over time. So for example, if a cow had got a liver copper concentration from her biopsy at the beginning of the study of 400 milligrams per kilogram dry matter, and at the end it had increased to 500 over the 100-day study, that would be an increase of 100 milligrams over 100 days. That would be an increase of 1 milligram per kilogram dry matter. If she started at 400 and reduced down to 300, then she would have lost 100 milligrams per kilogram dry matter, and the average would have been over the 100 days minus 1 milligram per kilogram dry matter. And if she'd stayed the same, then there would be no change. She'd be 400 at the end. So if we look at what happened, so this is now the liver change. Because we fed 19 milligrams, we expected the cows that didn't have the antagonist, they added sulfur molybdenum, they still had some in the background in the diet, but they added sulfur molybdenum. We expected them to be depositing copper within the liver. And that's what we found, quite high rates of liver deposition. When we added the sulfur molybdenum, we expected them both to be down in this region down here, round about this region, and mobilizing liver, because we anticipated that the sulfur and the molybdenum would be binding to the copper and making it unavailable within the rumen. And that is what we actually found when we fed the grass silage-based rations. They were lower, but when we fed the maize silage-based rations, then we didn't get that effect. In fact, they were slightly positive, and certainly they weren't mobilizing much copper. So there's a big difference here between the maize silage-based ration and the grass. The grass performed as we predicted, but the maize, the copper status was much higher. So that led us to think, is it the maize silage or the starch? So then we did a second study where we looked at the starch concentration. So we've just had this published in the Journal of Dairy Science. This time we used 60 cows and we fed 2 levels of starch, either low or high. And we either didn't add any sulfur molybdenum or we added sulfur and molybdenum in the diet. So that gave us 4 treatments, 2 starch levels, either without sulfur molybdenum or with sulfur molybdenum. And we measured rumen pH using these rumen pH boluses. And we know from previous studies that we've undertaken at Harper Adams that feeding a maize silage diet will often result in a lower rumen pH. We also supplemented in the ones where we gave the sulfur molybdenum 0.8 grams of sulfur and 4.5 milligrams of molybdenum. So this is a rumen pH bolus, about the same size as a mineral bolus that you would use on farm. And this is when it's put into the rumen. And you can see here when it goes in, it starts measuring rumen pH about every 15 minutes. It sits, because it's quite heavy, it sits within the reticulum. So that's the second stomach. And the reticulum tends to have a pH that's around about 0.2 higher than what you would get in the rest of the rumen. But you can see this nice cycle here. The animals would have been fed here, rumen pH will go down, back up again, and this nice cycle that would occur if you're monitoring rumen pH. You can use these commercially, but we use them to allow us to have the cows kept within the same conditions as the rest of the herd were. So if we look at the effect of the different diets, and I'm just looking at the effect of the low starch diet and the high starch, then we can see this nice cyclical effect here under the low starch diet. So going up here to about 6.6 and down to about 6.3, and the critical level would be above 6. That's what we want to avoid subacute ruminal acidosis. When we fed the higher starch diet, we had the same pattern, but it was consistently lower at about 0.2 to 0.3 pH units lower. But the important point is that it was always above this reticular pH of 6.0, and that would be equivalent to a rumen pH of about 5.8. So these cows, although they had a lower rumen pH, weren't suffering from subacute ruminal acidosis. Just to briefly summarize the performance results, the higher starch intake increased milk protein content, which is what we would expect from feeding higher starch. The added sulfur molybdenum also decreased intake by 1.8, and that reflects what we found in the previous study. But again, there was no effective diet on plasma copper concentration, and all values were way above the lower threshold level. So what happened to liver copper concentration? So I'm going to express them in the same way as I did previously, and that is looking at the change over the study period, the 100 days. So if they are positive, it means that the liver is depositing copper and they are being fed copper above requirements. And if it's negative, then they are being fed copper under their requirements. So we can see here that the copper change was when this is the low starch diet and the high starch diet without the antagonists. And as we predicted, they're both depositing copper. But when we looked at adding the antagonists, then we found that the low starch diet performed as we expected. They were mobilizing copper because the sulfur molybdenum was locking up the copper mainly within the rumen and making it unavailable. But the high starch diet was not the case. They were either neutral or slightly positive, despite adding large amounts of sulfur molybdenum into the diet. And if we compare that with our previous slide of grass versus maize, then you can see that they are very similar, that feeding a high starch diet or a high maize diet that's going to reduce rumen pH also increases the copper status within the animal. And this, we feel, explains what was happening within our heifers. Going back to our heifers, that we feel it is this rumen pH change that is making the copper more available to the animals and increasing the copper status. So just to conclude, that most copper responsive disorders are due to sulfur molybdenum rather than low dietary copper concentrations. However, most dairy cows are overfed copper in the UK, and that's often coming from several different sources. And we now know that absorption is increased at lower rumen pHs that we would get in lactation diets. And the liver is a better indicator of copper status than blood. So in terms of take-home actions, I would recommend that you start off by analysing your forages for minerals, and one person is responsible for calculating the mineral supply and calculating the copper supply. And that person should include all sources of copper within the calculations. I would also recommend taking, if you feel that there's a problem, of looking at liver copper samples, and that is more accurate than using blood samples. And also bearing in mind that if you are feeding lactation diets that are higher in maize or higher in concentrates, that will result in a lower copper requirement rather than a higher requirement. Okay, And I shall finish at that and take any questions.
Thank you for this very interesting, comprehensive presentation, Liam. Lots of questions are appearing already in the question box. So while we wait for some more questions to be added, we would like to remind you that if you are Dairy Pro registered, please put your name, date of birth, and farm name including the postcode, into the question box. So we will go ahead and take some time to answer your questions now. The first one, is there a breed effect on the requirements?
Well, there are. Jerseys tend to be different to Holsteins. So Jerseys tend to increase their absorption of copper. So there is a breed difference, not as big a difference as you will get in sheep. But yes, Jerseys tend to be different from Holsteins.
Okay, let me just fetch another question. What is the target copper molybdenum ratio in a complete diet?
Well, the molybdenum tends to be the background level, so you haven't really got control over that. So you're not adding molybdenum in any mineral source. It's a reflection of what the background levels are. So that's really determined by your analysis as to how much you have within that. But most rations would be somewhere around about 1.3 to 1.5 milligrams of molybdenum. And assuming that your sulfur is around about 2 to 2.5, then you would need round about 11 milligrams of copper, perhaps up to 13, but round about that level. So if you've got 1.5 milligrams of molybdenum, then that's roughly 8 times, your copper concentration will be roughly 8 times that amount. But as we saw from the previous graphs, it's determined by your sulfur and your molybdenum. The two interact with each other, and rumen pH seems to have an effect as well. So if you had higher levels of sulfur, then that ratio would change.
Okay, thank you, Liam. This is another question regarding minerals. What is the effect of iron on copper availability?
Yeah, it's a good question. We know that iron has an effect. We are not really able to quantify that effect. We can with sulfur molybdenum, but iron, it's more difficult. In most situations, iron is not particularly going to be a major problem within diets, but you can have situations where it can be. If, for example, you've made grass silage and there's been a lot of soil incorporated, or indeed under grazing situations, then not only can there be contamination of the soil from just plodding around and soil on the leaves, but animals can actually tear up some of the root material as they're grazing and taking some soil. And some work in France has shown that, in fact, grazing cows can be taking somewhere between 0.5 to 1 kilogram of soil per day under that. So iron does, under most dietary situations, I don't think it's a major problem, but it is worth looking at. Some farms, they should be analysing their water, because iron concentrations in water can vary quite a lot, and that can have a significant contribution, and is often underestimated on many farms. So knowing what's in the water can be influential. On the surveys that we didn't find a particular variation, but that will depend very much on the underlying soil conditions.
Yes, thanks, Liam. We actually had a question on the high iron levels in borehole water.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I would recommend taking that into account. It's more difficult to quantify what the effect would be. I mean, research has shown that there is an effect, but it really doesn't justify feeding above the 20 milligrams, even under very high levels. But if you consider it's a problem, then I would say look at liver concentrations and see what's happening within the animals as a check, because we're not able to quantify the effect of iron quite as well. James, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, you have outwintering there, Liam. Potentially some forage is used in outwintering where you have very high sulfur concentrations naturally, low copper concentrations, and then that was compounded by vast quantities of soil intake.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, James. We did some work with outwintering heifers a few years ago, where we were looking at the mineral status. So something like fodder beet, they can take a lot in. Kale is high in sulfur. And can also be quite low in copper as well. So outwintering could be a situation. We found that providing the animals with boluses certainly improved their mineral status, although it didn't have any performance effects. It did improve and rectify some mineral problems.
Awesome, thank you, Liam. This is a question regarding liver biopsies. In which point of lactation do you want to do liver biopsy? Is it after 3 months in lactation?
It doesn't really make an awful lot of difference. If you're proficient at doing the technique, then it's quite a routine technique. You may want to leave the animals, not go at a time when they're under a lot of other metabolic stress. But we would do them at any particular point. It shouldn't make an awful lot of difference. If you wanted to leave animals until they're a little bit later into lactation, that's okay. We've not had any detrimental effects, but of course it is an invasive procedure, so things can go wrong within that as well. It's not like something like fatty liver syndrome where you need to go early. You can go at various points, and that's why cull cows can be used as well.
Okay, thank you, Liam. Another question: what effect does lactation and pregnancy have on copper requirements?
Well, the amount of copper required by the fetus increases. The actual way it's done is that it steps at a certain point of lactation, of gestation. So it actually it's not a smooth effect, just the way that the equations are worked out. But no, it does have an effect. Fetal requirements can be reasonably high. Milk as well, and obviously that's directly related to milk yield, and the higher the milk yield. But most equations within rationing programs would take that into account. So the fetal requirements would be very low for the first trimester, increasing to the second and the third trimester. They could be a reasonable amount.
Okay, thank you. We then have a question: if high copper levels from a biopsy are discovered, do you recommend removing all supplements copper, and for how long?
Yeah, I think if they are, if you do have a situation, then I would, certainly reduce, if not remove. I mean, under situations of copper toxicity, people would go in and perhaps give, additional molybdenum in there. But under commercial circumstances, removing it takes a while for liver copper concentrations to change. I mean, we were feeding quite high levels, 19 milligrams, and we were getting about 0.75 to 1 milligram increase. So if you're going from, say, 300 to 500, it's going to take several months for you to start to see any difference. And of course, in doing something like a liver biopsy, there's a large amount of between animal variation as well. So if you're doing it commercially on farm, you're unlikely to do the same animals a second time, whether it is 6 months after. I'd probably say you would need to leave it around about a 6-month period to see if you're having an effect. But of course, you have to bear in mind that there's a lot of variation in there, and we really don't understand why we can have cows that are well above that 510 milligrams that appear to be performing okay. The work that James did would indicate that appearances can be deceptive, and animals can be performing well, but nevertheless be compromised in terms of the liver performance. But we don't fully understand why some animals can have levels that really you would say, well, why isn't this animal dead of copper toxicity? And other animals with lower levels succumb to toxicity. So there's a lot of between animal variation within there. So to answer the question, I would probably say you would need to leave it around about 6 months or so. But bear in mind, you're not sampling from the same animal, and there may be a lot of between animal variation. So you need to have several animals to sample from. to give you a reasonable idea. So, I would say, we would generally, statistically, we have quite a high number, but on farm, 5 or 6 animals would probably be the minimum.
Okay, thanks, Liam. Another question. What is your opinion on mineral injections, particularly multimin, for young stock, particularly around weaning with respect to mineral toxicities?
Well, I think what we're speaking about is really the amount that's being fed rather than the mode of delivery. And if a farmer prefers to deliver it in a certain means, whether that's injection or boluses or free access minerals, which can be a little bit erratic in terms of intake, I'm not really giving an opinion as to which mode of delivery. It's taking into account how much is actually being provided. But providing something like an injection, you are relying on a large spike in terms of copper there, and relying on that to be deposited in the liver, and then the liver to slowly release that over a period of time. Whereas others, such as boluses, are releasing more slowly over time and consistently, because that that's gone into each individual animal. Something like free access minerals, if you look at work that's been done in terms of how many animals would actually use it, only about 60 or 70% of animals would regularly use free access minerals. So they can be a bit erratic, particularly under a grazing situation.
Okay, thank you, Liam. We have another question. Do gut worms or diarrhea change the requirements of copper due to lower absorption?
Yeah, I think they would. I'd be pushed to say what the what the quantitative effect would be. But yes, they would affect it. I think under that circumstances, try and rectify those problems first, rather than going in and just adding more copper to try and rectify an underlying problem from something else. So my advice would be try and resolve those issues. Rather than just saying, well, copper might be affected, so I'll supply more. I mean, there is this adage that some is good, more must be better. And for many minerals, oversupplying isn't a problem. You can oversupply zinc several-fold, and you don't have a major issue. But the problem with oversupplying copper is that you do have this this copper buildup within the liver, which could be creating problems. So I would say solve the initial problem rather than trying to get around it by just giving more copper.
Okay. Thanks, Liam. We have another question. Is copper source important, or will sulfate do the job?
Well, sulfate is the most, one of the most common. There's a large number of sources out there. In terms of what we would call the inorganic ones, so things such as copper sulfate or copper chloride or copper carbonate, then yes, there are differences. Copper sulfate, if we had an index of about 1, then copper chloride might come out to be 1.15. The one that really is lower is copper oxide. Copper oxide would be included in some mineral boluses, but although it is lower, it is felt that because of the way it's released within the rumen, that actually the copper might become lodged within the abomasum and increase the copper availability. There's lots of claims made for organic sources. We've used some and not really found much difference to copper sulfate, but there are ones out there. I would advise, if you're going to use one, is to find out what independent evidence they have for any beneficial effects that there may be. So yes, there are differences. It's a difficult thing to determine the copper bioavailability. It's not easy from an experimental point of view. You can look at blood copper concentrations, you can look at liver copper concentrations. So they, as a means of determining it, and particularly in cattle as well, it can be difficult to actually give a definitive value. And a lot of studies that have been done looking at different sources of copper, particularly organic sources, have often used combinations as well. And that can often make it difficult to see, was it the copper that's having an effect, or is it something else that's having an effect?
Okay, thank you, Liam. We have a final question. Does the application of lime then should be taken into consideration when we feed copper?
Well, lime, the reasons for including lime are to do with crop production, and you will get an enhanced crop production, and you should apply lime, to do that. There's a financial return. We know that applying lime can increase molybdenum. My advice is to do a forage sample, analyze it for the minerals, and move from there. So it's not you could say, well, if I don't lime, and if I don't apply sulfur, then I'll be better off. You won't be better off. Your decrease in performance will way outweigh any effect. Apply the sulfur that's necessary, apply the lime that's necessary according to your farm and individual fields, analyze your forage, and then quantify how much copper you need to feed, would be my advice.
Okay, well, this was the last question. Thank you, Liam and James. We have a couple of additional questions we have not answered due to time, so we will get back to you individually by email. There will be a feedback form on the screen after the webinar and also in the follow-up email. So please take the time to complete the questions, as this will help us with future webinars. And before we finish, we would like to remind you a couple of upcoming AHDB Dairy webinars. Tomorrow, so October the 6th, we have the webinar on calf pneumonia. Prevention is less costly than the cure, between 1 and 2:15 p.m. And next week, October 14th, we have the webinar on selecting bulls for a better block. So you can visit this link to register your place and view more of our upcoming webinars. So we have had a great turnout and participation in this webinar. So a big thanks to all of you for listening. A special thanks goes to Christian Goodall, who works behind the scenes to make sure everything goes smoothly. And finally, a very special thanks to Liam and James for taking the time out of the schedule to be with us this evening. Thank you all and good night.